So that's a lot to unpack. That's a lot for our ears to digest on just the first listen. So that's what I'm trying to give here with this exit slip today, is identifying some of the characteristics in the right-hand column that describe what's happening in the first theme, in the transitions, in the second theme, parts 1 and 2, and in the closing theme. I just stopped it at the start of the development. So we have made it all the way through the exposition so far. And over here on the board, I'm just kind of keeping track of the biggest, most important things that are jumping out at my ears as I listen. I'm trying not to give romantic or modern characteristics too much. I did make that comment about the lyrical horn melody, or I did write down some of these disjunct melodies in the trumpets and then in the violins. But regardless of whether you're on Team Modernist or Team Romantic, to the whole class, how many of you would say this sounds like Romanticism in the style of Tchaikovsky and Mussorgsky? This sounds like Nutcracker Suite, or it sounds maybe like Pictures at an Exhibition. Does it remind you at all of that? How many would say this sounds a little bit more like the Stravinsky Rite of Spring harmonies that I've heard? I'm hearing a lot of dissonance. The harmonies don't sound like they're always major or minor. I'm hearing a lot more rhythmic energy and ostinatos going on. How many of you would be on that side? Okay, so if you are on one of the romantic Russian critics side, then I want you to prepare your thoughts as to what might be a problem for you if you're hearing these modern traits. On the other hand, if I forced you all to be a devil's advocate, what would you say is the most romantic part of this piece of music?
Either the lyrical soul for the French boys or the violin sweetness.
Yeah. So there are several characteristics. There are many right answers to the question of what makes this piece sound traditionally romantic. One factor might be the lyrical horn solo that we just heard kicking in that third minute of this piece of music. It's very soft. It's not going to be as strident. However, while it is very legato and smooth in its horn melodic timbre, it is also very disjunct. Many of the notes in that horn melody are not side by side. So it has the articulation, smooth legato style of something you might hear from a Tchaikovsky Swan Lake or a ballet. But the way the notes are composed is jumping around like it's something out of a Schoenberg piece, maybe, or even a Stravinsky. So that's a little bit of getting it both ways. What about the overall formal structure of this piece? Is sonata-allegro a new formal structure to the 20th century modernist idea? How far back does that go, Jacob? You remember which era did we start studying the sonata-allegro form? What's one of the first composers that used sonata-allegro? Yeah, it goes all the way back to the classical era. All the way back to Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. Good. So this is a very traditional formal structure. And for a savvy music listener who is expecting music to be in a traditional format, right away, getting this exposition with a theme one, a transition, a second theme, a closing theme, a development, a recapitulation, that is a very familiar format and formal structure to those romantic ideals. So that would have felt very comfortable to traditionalists. Let's go through it though one more time, and I encourage you, please work together, get a Russian critic partner, or see if you can persuade someone around you to be a modernist. But what I'd like you to do right now is, and we're going to listen to it all the way through one more time, and I want you to see if you can find the best timestamp that represents when each of these sonata-allegro exposition sections are going to kick off. The first one is obviously at 0 seconds. But when do you hear that rising melodic theme give way to a lot of little violin scale fragments. There's a very heroic, famous melody in this entire piece that basically goes da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da dee da da. And that had a very Russian heritage to it that a lot of those traditional critics were satisfied and thought was really something to celebrate. It was a very proud, it is in a minor key, but it had a very heroic, strong nature to it that satisfied that romantic ideal. Listen for that theme one to kind of hold the glue together in several different sections of the piece. But it's eventually going to give way to a lot of fragmented rhythms in a rather dissonant, chromaticized scale fragment that indicates transition number one. Some people have suggested that Shostakovich got away with playing all of these dissonant harmonies by playing them so fast. He wrote this piece to be performed at a very fast tempo. And when these harmonies go by super quick, even though they're very dissonant, our ears may not process them and they may be distracted by the longer, more soaring melodies that are soaring on top of all of that disjunct or dissonant harmonic material in the chords or the scalar fragments. So try to listen for slower melodic areas that have a romantic quality, but are supported by fast-moving scales that have a more dissonant modern quality. When we get to the second theme, there's a bit of a hint because the cameraman's going to zoom in on the trumpet player. When you hear this trumpet solo, it is very disjunct. It does not have two notes that are side by side, another very common modern characteristic. And then eventually the violins are going to pick up that disjunct leaping melody that represents the second themes, part one and part two. There's another transition with some low brass and heavy percussion, but then we'll finish off with that lyrical horn melody that's very legato smooth, but very disjunct. All right, see if you can find the timestamps. You are permitted and encouraged to work together. Those fast-moving lines in there, those are not major scales. Those are not minor scales. That is a highly chromaticized scalar fragment. Now the oboe has that theme one melody. It's going to jump around to several sections. These violin fragments . Timization, we're in a new key. Listen for the new melody coming up. This is your second theme. It's going to get picked up by the violins in a little bit. Listen for your closing theme in the French one. Now, if we were to go on into the development section, it would get even more modernized. It's going to fragment, it's going to tonicize, it's going to jump around in many different keys. It's going to take little pieces of those disjunct melodies that we heard, and it's going to disjunct them and irregulate them in many new ways. It's going to be very, if this wasn't hard enough to follow for just the first 4 minutes, the development section is going to be even more challenging to traditional Romantic ears. But before I give you a few more insights on what those Russian critics or what those modern listeners said about this piece of music, has everyone been able to identify their best guess for the timestamps? I was underlying, I hope that those hints were helpful. Let's see. William, did you have a guess for the transition where those violin scale fragments kick in?
154.
154, very close. Let's see, let me hear what 154 sounds like, because I think we're definitely in transition material at 154. The question is that where it really starts to break down from that theme 1 area? So, yeah, I hear lots of little scale fragments, definitely a lot of fragmentation right there to dilute the opening key signature and get us into the second theme's key signature. Now the big question is 154 where that first kicks in, or does that fragmentation happen a little before that? Someone just has to have some romantic melodies going on. Let's go back a little bit earlier. How about 130? And let's hear where the theme 1 gives way to fragmentation. I like 154. If you wrote 154 on your test, I would accept 154 because I think someone can make a case that starts earlier. So I'm not saying that's the only answer I would accept, but I think we finally get the last hints of theme 1 around 1 minute and 50 seconds. But did anyone have a timestamp earlier than 154? Jacob, what'd you have?
138.
138. And did you also have anyone else have something around 138? Okay, let's go back. I want to hear 138 again. That was what I had. But I think that, because I think 138 is about the first place that we start to hear all of these fragments kicking in. But the reason I would take Williams 154 is we still hear a couple little last dying grasps of that theme 1 trying to hang around even after those fragments kick in at 138. But let's listen to that one more time, because this is one of those fun places in music where I think there's more than one right answer to how we analyze what we're hearing. So I would say 138, 136, or 154. Does anyone else have something entirely different than that they'd like to make a case for? Cool. All right. So I'd say 138, 154. Those are solid choices for transition number 1. Let's see. Hey, Allie, where did you have that trumpet disjunct second theme solo beginning? 218. All right. Let's go check that out. Yeah. might start a second or two before that, but I think 218 works. Let me hear from about 207, the end of the transition. 218 is when the videographer goes in on the trumpet player, so you definitely have that going for you. I think, can you hear the solo kicking in a few seconds before 218? Does anyone have a different time for that second theme kicking off? So I'd say around 214, 215 is about when that trumpet is first heard with that opening second theme solo. And then the violins get the same solo. When the violins play it, they play it much more legato and smoothly connected, but still with that disjunct melody. Whereas the trumpet, he's playing it a little bit more detached, a bit more angular or articulated with some accent. Let's listen for when that transition happens from the trumpet version of the second theme into the more legato violin version of the second theme. About 238. Does that make sense? Does everyone see how I got 238 there? Okay. And then this is kind of that second transition material. I would say anything in the neighborhood of 3 minutes. Anything really from 259 to 308 is going to be this second transition area. It's not really a melody, but it just kind of hammers home this very heroic, brassy, heavy percussion sound that gives way to our closing theme right here. Trey? What was your timestamp for the closing theme? 338. 338? Let's go double check that. Let's go double check that a little bit. I'm going to go back to 3 minutes is about where things are going to get really heavy in the percussion and the low brass. When you hear that horn solo, very high and soft, let's figure out where that timestamp should be. Yeah. Yeah, about 328, right? Yeah. So, and you got, and I don't have my big speakers with me today, but yeah, you can hear that. Hopefully, you can hear that the horn solo introduces our final theme, our closing theme around 328. It's been a few weeks since we reviewed a sonata-allegro form, and this is one of the last pieces in the entire class that we are going to be listening to sonata-allegro form in. So we're almost ready to say goodbye to this more complicated formal structure. But part of the reason I wanted to dig in deep on this particular piece is that in a few weeks, I know we just had an exam, but in a few weeks when we have our final exam, there will be one more formal structure sonata-allegro analysis. And this is the piece that I will invite you to identify all of the different subsections of the exposition and development